So welcome everybody to our 2021-2022 IU Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research Speaker Series. We're ecstatic to have Jonathan Mayer as our first speaker in 2022. He is an assistant professor of computer science and public affairs at Princeton University. And his topic today is the platform data crisis and how to solve it. And when he's done with his talk, we'll have an opportunity to have a Q&A with Dr. Mayer. And you can either put questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and I'll make sure to call on everybody. With that said, Jonathan, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually, not in person, as a Midwesterner and a fan of the work that you do at Indiana University. So I'm really excited to give this talk today. These are some ideas that I've been mulling over for quite some time and working on in technical research for quite some time, and haven't really had the opportunity to present in a sort of somewhat formal way and use as the basis of an open dialogue thus far. So I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on the content here. Before moving further in the content, I should note that this is very much not only my work. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with terrific researchers at Princeton, and also much of the work I'll be presenting towards the end of the talk about Rally and Web Sciences in collaboration with Mozilla, and they have a terrific team that's been working with us on those initiatives. Okay, so let me start with some motivation that I suspect will be familiar to just about everyone who's joined, that there are problems involving major technology platforms. I'm going to pick on Facebook a little bit, kind of as a frequent flyer, but I don't mean to single them out entirely. I'm going to have more to say about other platforms shortly. Right. So most recently, of course, a number of documents that were released by a whistleblower highlighted problems inside Facebook. One of the stories that got the most traction here on the left was about internal research that Instagram had done, identifying ways in which the platform might be toxic for teen girls, predominantly using survey methods. Right, so very serious mental health concerns associated with this extremely popular platform. Or going back a little bit further, of course, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was both a privacy issue and a democratic integrity issue, and I suppose also a national security issue. So recurring problems of conduct by the business that you might want to better understand, you might want to better identify early on, and have a full grasp of, so that you can respond to them through policy mechanisms. Again, I suspect I'm not saying anything new to folks here. Of course, these types of problems are not new. They're certainly not new in the context of Facebook. You can find plenty of sort of Mark Zuckerberg apology timelines if you're interested in them. A couple more examples here where there was a questionable business practice, and independent understanding of that practice was important and led to some corrective action. Right, so issues around disclosing customer data to businesses in ways customers might not expect, or the Beacon Initiative, which was 15 years ago now, where Facebook was integrating its services with other websites in ways that involved data disclosure, and again, customers didn't expect and didn't like. Again, an example where some independent understanding was valuable for getting a handle on the problem and understanding what to do about the problem. So, all right, I think I've picked on Facebook enough here. Suffice it to say, across a broad range of problems and a broad range of actors, platforms give some cause for concern. Again, I've been focusing on Facebook, but Apple, of course, is getting a lot of attention right now for competition concerns. Amazon has drawn a lot of scrutiny for competition concerns and consumer protection concerns especially around third-party sellers. Google of late, particularly in the hot seat around competition, and YouTube around radicalization and hate speech. Twitter, lots of criticism around mis and disinformation. Microsoft of late, in fact, there's some news reporting about how they've sort of managed to fly under the radar rather successfully. But of late, still some real criticism around competition. TikTok is sort of relatively understudied, but there's increasing concern around mental health effects and addiction and privacy, among other issues. And then Snapchat kind of in the same social media milieu, maybe to a lesser extent. So these problems aren't specific to Facebook. I've already touched on what some of these rather serious and urgent societal problems are. And the core motivation for this talk is that these platforms don't provide adequate data for studying these types of problems, right? Across a range of actors in the technology space, across a range of problems, we just don't have the data we need to understand the problems. So in today's talk, I'd like to move through 3 topics. The first is trying to explain why this crisis we're in is so important for society and why it's rather difficult to solve through technical means or law and public policy means. The second topic I want to get into is how law and public policy can respond to this crisis. And I'll briefly touch on some proposals in the United States and the European Union and the upshot of those proposals and the limitations of those proposals. And then third, I want to talk to you about a couple of technical systems that my group has been developing in collaboration with Mozilla, trying to provide a path forward independent of legislative proposals. And we view them as very much complementary, right? We should be doing all of these things and in a big way. So that's the last topic I want to get into. Okay, so let me start with just some more background on the crisis as it is and why it's so difficult. Again, a point I suspect will not require much persuasion. Independent fact-finding about technology platforms is a key means of enabling oversight and accountability of those platforms, not just for public discourse, writing academic papers, talking about academic papers, writing media accounts, or talking about those accounts, but this is core to the function of democratic self-governance, right? If we want Congress or federal regulatory agencies to be able to step in when there are societal harms, we need to understand those societal harms. And in my own experience working at a federal agency and working in Congress on these very types of issues, there is just very, very little access to empirical understanding. I'll say more about that shortly. Now I want to note that this notion is not at all new. Right? This idea that we need some independent fact-finding to hold accountable entities that play an important role in modern life and have incentives that might be different from commercial incentives that might be different from what's in society's best interest, right? This is something we've dealt with in the United States for over a century, right? It's not a new problem. And just to give a few examples of this, I don't mean to suggest here that Facebook is tobacco. I appreciate there are people who draw that analogy, think of that what you will, but the broader notion of independent fact-finding being essential, I think is just unambiguously the case, right? So, an example here being the energy industry making claims about climate change for a number of years that didn't really hold up, and climate science has been, as an academic endeavor, very successful in changing minds about that issue and ultimately leading to some very significant policy changes. Or in the case of smoking, right, public health and medical research for decades worked to elucidate facts that played a key role in legislation and regulation there. Or, this is an academic research, but some of the most storied investigative journalism in US history was digging up facts about the Standard Oil monopoly around the turn of the last century and in using that to justify government intervention with respect to the monopoly, right? So again, not new, I don't think a hard case to make in US history. The problem we have right now is that doing that kind of independent fact-finding is really difficult, right? So the platforms aren't providing the data you need, and I'll say more about that shortly. And the toolkit we otherwise have as researchers and also as journalists and legislators is very, very limited. So let me say a little bit more about the academic toolkit we do have. There are some viable methods that studies can use and have used to understand technology platform problems, right? So interviews, for example, go talk to users, go talk to competitors of the platforms, or surveys, same idea, but with a survey instrument. Laboratory tasks and crowd tasks show up quite a bit in the literature, where you simulate user engagement with the platform in some way and look at how the user behaves in conducting that task. So, to give an example there's a cottage industry of literature about mis and disinformation warnings involving these types of tasks, right? So the users see some, they're presented with some content, they're presented with a simulated warning, and then they're asked questions about, would you share that content on social media? Do you believe that content is real, right? So those kinds of simulated tasks are quite common in the literature. In fact, there's a recent literature survey on mis and disinformation warnings finding, I think it was about 90% of papers on mis and disinformation warnings use those methods. Web crawls, of course, show up quite a bit in the literature, and access to public social media activity, especially on Twitter, where the vast majority of activity is public, and there are ways of accessing public data. That shows up quite a lot in the literature too. So there are some methods available, but those methods are very, very limited in ways that are of great significance for holding platforms accountable. So, for example, many of these methods don't capture real user behavior. They capture, when they interact with users, self-reported behavior, or to the extent they get behavior, it's a public behavior on Twitter. That's like what you get, right? And there's a lot of reason to be skeptical of self-reported behavior. There's been over a decade of studies looking at how users report their online activity versus what they actually do online, and the work in the space suggests there's a pretty significant delta there. Outside of the context of online activity, of course, there are decades of research comparing individual actions to individual self-reported actions and beliefs and behaviors, and it's long been a delta in many areas. Okay, so that's one limitation. Another is that many of the challenges we care about around platforms relate to the choice architectures and information environments presented by those platforms, right? So, for example, the area of literature known as dark patterns, which I've worked in quite a bit of late, relates to how the presentation of content on an online service might channel a user towards specific decisions about their privacy or purchasing decisions or something else that raises societal concerns. And it's just incredibly difficult to come up with a simulated task that adequately captures the real experience. You can try, but very often you run into problems of being able to poke holes, and it's not realistic in one way or another, right? Like the consumer doesn't actually have any money on the line, or it doesn't adequately mimic the real experience of the online service. And so that quickly calls into question the study methods, or sometimes the study methods just aren't available. So to give an example again from the mis and disinformation warning literature, there's a reason why the vast majority of the literature has these simple methods of show some content, show a warning, ask some survey questions about it, right? It would be incredibly difficult to come up with a method of simulating a user's actual choice about what to share on social media, right? Like how do you actually put someone in a social media environment where it's like what they're actually sharing with their friends, they're making similar judgments on the spot about credibility and what they view as appropriate on a social media platform, right? So these simulated tasks are in some sense not entirely not as persuasive as you might hope, because there's just no way to come up with a more persuasive simulated task. Okay, so another key limitation here is many of the problems related to tech platforms involve targeted or personalized content, right? So recommender systems, for example, have come under tremendous scrutiny as potentially causing echo chambers or filter bubbles or online radicalization, which I'll touch on shortly. personalized or targeted online advertising has also drawn great concern around, potential disparate impact in that advertising, ways in which it might exploit consumer psychology. And it is very, very difficult to defensively study that type of content with the methods we have. And I'll give an example of that shortly, but the sort of key issue here is that if you want to study personalized or targeted content, you need some way of defensively getting a distribution of content shown to real users and a representative or representative-ish sample of real users, right? If you throw a crawler at some online service and look at what recommendations it makes, it's very difficult to say what the actual types of recommendations would be to a real user. And then, of course, you have these sort of follow-on complexities of users then make decisions about those recommendations, which in turn inform future recommendations, right? And so sort of studying that entire feedback cycle is essentially not possible with ordinary web crawling methods. Another issue is that for many of the platforms of concern, private activities are important, right? So, on Twitter, again, much of the activity is public, so there's some ability to study it, but like Facebook, much of the activity is not public, and there isn't access to that non-public activity. Or YouTube viewing activity, right? You can see your own YouTube viewing activity, but by design, that's not publicly announced on the platform. So there isn't access to the type of data you might need to study problems through public social media archives. And then last, I just want to emphasize that for many issues you might care about, interventions of various sorts, or at minimum asking users directed questions is important, right? Passive measurement is not going to give you enough to understand the problem. In fact, in the Facebook study around Instagram and teen mental health, right? They used survey methods, right? They didn't just passively monitor what was going on the platform. They had to deliberately conduct an experiment involving their users. And finding ways to apply interventions is particularly difficult on the platforms, and particularly difficult when the platforms are not interested in cooperating. Okay, so I appreciate this has been like a little bit abstract. So let me try to give a very specific example of the type of thing you might want to study on a platform and why it has been so difficult to study. So I want to focus here on far-right radicalization on YouTube. Zeynep Tufekci wrote this terrific opinion piece. She's faculty at UNC, highlighting anecdotally how it seemed like YouTube was facilitating these radicalization pathways. People would start seeing some content that had a political valence, and then they would see, further and further right content. And subsequently, Kevin Roos at the Times did a wonderful set of reporting and a podcast series called Rabbit Hole, looking at, again, some anecdotes of exactly this type of phenomenon, right? So good examples of anecdotes, but you probably want to move beyond anecdotes and get some empirical understanding were you to, for example, step in with legislation or regulation. There has been literature in this area, but it's been an area where the literature has been really challenged by the methods available. So some of the earliest work was just manual data collection and qualitative evaluation, right? Here are the channels that are out there. Here's what they seem to be doing, a valuable step. Some subsequent work has used web crawling, trying to extract, whatever data could be extracted. In one instance, looking at recommendations, and that study actually drew a fair amount of criticism in the academic community for not having defensible methods for studying recommendations, right? The idea being crawling was not sufficiently representative of real user behavior, and didn't sufficiently capture the feedback loop between the recommender system and users. There's some work that looked at comments, right? So comments are one of the few public signals we have on YouTube. So that tried to at least understand what we could understand from comments. Same for a project looking at search results, again, trying to draw very limited inferences there. And then of late, there have been a few projects going beyond that sort of a manual or automated data collection from the platforms one project by folks at Penn using commercial browsing data. I'll say more about that later on. Another using a custom web browser extension. Again, I'll have a lot more to say about that. And then there's a project by some Princeton colleagues that's ongoing, trying to use crowd tasks and simulate a YouTube interface in different types of recommendations. So a broad range of methods getting applied here, all of them with some very significant limitations. And this is a problem that folks have been talking about now for 4 years, a very, very serious societal problem. And we still don't really have a great handle on it. And we don't have a great pathway to getting the science done that will give us a good handle on it. So this is the kind of problem that I mean when I talk about the platform data crisis, and why the existing methods are not sufficient. Okay, so I focused on academic research thus far. Let me say a little bit about investigative journalism and legislation. So there's been wonderful investigative journalism and tech accountability. Of course, of late, the Wall Street Journal's Facebook Files series and all the others who reported on the Frances Haugen documents just did terrific work. But that's a pretty limited form of transparency, right? If you're relying on ex-employees to come forward and disclose confidential company material, that's asking an awful lot. And that's going to give you a pretty limited perspective into what the company is doing. And as for legislative fact-finding, that predominantly relies on anecdotes from ex-employees or customers or competitors, which are valuable and can be the basis for reports and ultimately legislation, but it's certainly not the rich legislative record you might hope for an intervention in a rather significant part of the economy. In my own experience working on Capitol Hill, I mean, it was like pulling teeth to get any sort of data out of the platforms. And ultimately, for the matters I worked on, we had to threaten subpoenas and get into legal tussling about what Congress could request and what the scope of laws that might limit Congress's requests were, and it was rather unpleasant. So both of these other means of potentially providing independent fact finding are to some extent obstructed and certainly very limited these days. Okay, so platforms, of course, could voluntarily open up. And I'm going to pick on Facebook just a little bit more. They have perhaps not the best track record in this area. So they bought a company called CrowdTangle that provides some aggregate data about content on the platform to researchers. That data is of limited value. And then as researchers started to use it and kind of point out some things that were not so conducive to Facebook's public image, they very deliberately shifted resources away from the platform. And that resulted in some rather public spats between Facebook, some folks who were using the platform, and the folks who had built the platform and subsequently left Facebook. There was also a rather awkward moment where, in response to some independent oversight using CrowdTangle data, most prominently a Twitter feed that Kevin Roos set up, pointing out the sort of most popular content on the platform according to CrowdTangle's metrics. Facebook then released its own report with different metrics about the most popular content on the platform, and some observers noted it was a little odd that they'd sort of released the second report in what seemed to be a series and not the first, and it emerged that they'd actually tanked the initial report using their own metrics, because by their own metrics in the first report, concerning content was actually the most popular content on the platform. So not a great track record there with CrowdTangle in terms of what's available and how Facebook has interacted with the community of users of CrowdTangle. There's another initiative by Facebook called Social Science One that was sort of the grand collaboration between Facebook and researchers in the wake of the 2016 election, and it wound up being a dismal failure. There was some decent work on privacy-preserving analysis that came out of the project, but it wound up making very little useful data available to researchers, and then it emerged that Facebook had messed up the data it made available to researchers, and so a series of academic studies that relied on that data are now going to have to get redone and reissued. So pretty messy and embarrassing. But again, I don't just want to pick on Facebook. So let me give an example from my own research. At one point, after I'd been working in the Senate on mis and disinformation, I came to Princeton and I asked Twitter if I could get a copy of some data I needed for my research to study mis and disinformation trends on the platform. And they passed me over to their enterprise sales team and quoted me nearly $18 million for the research data that I wanted to try to understand their own mis and disinformation problem. Facebook is not the only offender here. There is a little bit of cause for optimism. So Facebook has spun up some new collaborations around the 2020 election, where they've been working closely with a set of academic collaborators to understand activity on the platform and try some intervention studies. That's currently limited in who they're collaborating with and the topics they're working on, but at least it's the first steps of maybe something that looks a little more sustainable. Twitter, very much to their credit, now provides full access to the complete archive of public tweets to academic researchers. If you're interested in this type of research, I highly recommend submitting to Twitter for that access. It's actually relatively painless, and in my experience has worked rather well. So I think they deserve kudos for that. And then they also recently conducted a study with a limited degree of academic collaboration on echo chambers and filter bubbles, political echo chambers and filter bubbles on the platform that came out in PNAS. And so, like Facebook, a little bit of a glimmer of hope of what collaborations could look like going forward. And that's about it, right? Remember, I had sort of all the tech companies up that you might want to study, right? We've got a little bit from Facebook, a little bit of Twitter, and that's about it, right? Is Google going to give researchers data to understand potential anti-competitive business practices by Google? Like, no way. It would be like malpractice for them to do it. Same for Amazon. There is progress, but compared to the overall problem landscape, I would submit that the progress is nowhere near where it needs to be. In addition to platforms not giving the data that you would hope they would give, they also from time to time obstruct data access. So I suspect many folks saw the spat between Facebook and a terrific team at NYU studying political advertising. So the Twitter team, or I'm sorry, the NYU team was using browser extension to collect information about the ads that were shown to volunteers and how those ads were targeted. Facebook had been unhappy about the work for a long time and it interfered with the work in various ways, and ultimately sent them a cease and desist letter and shut down their personal Facebook accounts, which was a little odd because the browser extension still worked. Facebook claimed that they needed to do this because of an FTC consent decree. Folks who had looked at the consent decree at the time knew that was a bogus argument. The FTC within days came out and said this is a bogus argument, which was not great for Facebook, but at the same time, they haven't backpedaled. So an instance where not only are they not facilitating data access, but for folks who try to do this type of research, they're getting in the way of it. That's not unique to the NYU team's experience. Here's one of my favorite comments in the source code about platform accountability that I've seen. I appreciate it's a weird setup, but bear with me. So this is a comment from a project that was originally by the investigative newsroom ProPublica and later by the Globe and Mail. They took it over to understand Facebook political ad transparency, similar to what the NYU team was doing. And Facebook kept messing with them. They deliberately make little changes to how the Facebook website was organized to break their data collection. And so eventually the journalists working on this started writing little notes to Facebook engineers in their source code on GitHub saying like please don't do this. Like, let's get a beer or coffee or something like that. Because, it doesn't have to be this way. To my knowledge, no one at Facebook ever took them up on the offer. But at any rate, just another example of ways in which platforms can, in some instances, have messed with independent data oversight efforts. Okay. So the last point I want to make about the sort of platform data crisis overall is that there are just a bunch of complexities to it that make trying to make progress on this crisis rather difficult. One is that this is about more than access to data, right? Being able to see what users do on a platform is important, but for many problems you care about, you want to ask questions like, what would a hypothetical differently designed service or different user interface do to the user experience? Sort of play out that counterfactual a little bit. You might want to try to run causal studies, in which case interventions can be very important. And so the sort of passive access that this problem is sometimes characterized as, in my mind, is important, but one piece of the puzzle, and interventions are important too. Another problem that sort of been a theme here is platforms have the means and strong incentives, commercial incentives, and of course their public image to get in the way of data access that facilitates accountability, right? Even if you had some way of trying to nudge them towards data access, they're going to have strong incentives, and they're going to have a lot of different ways they can act on those incentives to slow walk research or journalism or legislative oversight in ways that might not be obvious, right? There are a bunch of arguments you might make around privacy or security or trade secrets or so on that could, at minimum, add a lot of friction to the type of work you might want to see. Another challenge is figuring out who gets the platform data and the ability to run experiments on platforms. Right? Often this is pitched as an academic problem. That's how it's tended to be discussed, for example, in the EU, where there's some legislation I'm going to touch on shortly. But much of the best work in this area isn't by academics, it's by civil society groups or investigative journalists. And so figuring out how to include them in the aperture of platform data is a significant challenge. Another issue is figuring out ethics here, right? Platforms experiment on their users all the time. And so there's a little bit of an irony in thinking through, if folks who are trying to be more responsible than the platforms are experimenting on folks on the platforms, they're held to different standards, but as academics, we hold ourselves to higher standards. And so there are hard questions about, should there be some flavor of opt-in consent if you're going to study platforms, users on platforms, either by obtaining their data or by interacting with them in some way? Does there have to be opt-in consent, right? It might just be the common rule as currently written, doesn't leave any wiggle room here. And challenges like that for non-academics, right? So obviously news organizations or civil society organizations aren't going to have their own institutional review board, but you could have something like that. And so should you have something like that is a hard problem. And then last, who decides, right? Like, let's suppose there's a tussle around platform data. The platform doesn't want to play ball. Some outsider wants data access to run an experiment. Who's actually well positioned to figure out the right outcome there? And these are going to be some really hard problems I'm going to come back to very soon in talking through legislative and public policy proposals in this space. Okay, so that wraps up what I wanted to cover about why, in my mind, this is so important for society and why solving the problems here is really quite challenging. So now I want to shift gears into some law and policy proposals that would make progress on the platform data crisis. So I don't want to go sort of too far in depth on the proposals that have been made, partly because the details vary, partly because none of these have really gotten to the stage where, we have a bill that's about to become law. Probably the closest is the EU Digital Services Act, but there's still an awful lot of negotiation, or at least purported negotiation about it. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I do want to note that there have been now a handful of proposals like this. The earliest, to my knowledge, in the US was a report and a draft bill that Senator Mark Warner's team did in 2018. In the EU, the Digital Services Act, which has been moving forward, has an article that provides for academic research data access. There was a Democratic House bill in the early part of 2021 related to data access specific to advertising transparency. Later in 2021, Nate Persily at Stanford suggested a draft bill that was a sort of broader platform data access bill. And then his bill became the basis for what is now a bipartisan Senate bill towards the end of 2021. So that's a quick sketch of sort of how these ideas are percolating in law and public policy. And let me quickly touch on how these proposals in general, I'm going to sort of do some high level generalization here again, because none of these are quite at the stage where they're, seemingly about to become law without changes. And because the details really do vary a lot in ways that are sort of difficult to capture. So let me do just like a very high level take of how I see those proposals aligning with the challenges that I laid out for solving the platform data crisis, right? So with respect to doing more than providing access to platform data, generally these proposals really only cover data access. They don't cover experimentation. And so if the thing you want to understand involves passive observation of users on the platform, then these types of proposals might give you what you need. But the moment you want to start surveying or interviewing users or asking questions like how would users act in a different user interface or choice architecture, these proposals kind of run out of road. So that's an important limitation. And that is not to say these proposals are fixed. I think this is something that it would be good to amend into some of the proposals as they move forward. But at any rate, as currently drafted, that's a limitation. With respect to platform obstructionism, or at least not going out of their way to help, as I mentioned, they have all sorts of ways in which they could try to slow walk research. And it is really hard in legislation like this to come up with a process that is going to prevent that kind of slow walking, right? Like, I think there are just so many non-frivolous arguments a platform could come up with in this area that it is going to be tough to enforce short-term timelines. Some of these proposals have clocks built in that could help, and maybe that'll work, but at least there's some cause for hesitation there. Another challenge is, again, the scoping problem. Most of these proposals only provide full coverage for academic research. Some provide partial coverage for non-academic research. As I mentioned, I think much of the best work here is not academic. And so, if you limit this to academic work by just the scoping provisions, you're going to carve off some of the most important platform accountability work. So that's not great. These proposals have differing approaches to the ethical issues around platform data. I think it's fair to say the most recent proposals seem to contemplate a clean room model of sorts, this idea that researchers would sort of integrate into a platform. They'd have access to some computing facility, possibly on the physical premises of the platform, and there wouldn't be opt-in consent, right? These would be studies run kind of like the studies of the platforms. That makes me kind of uncomfortable. I think that is an awkward place for academic researchers to be, and again, query sort of how that aligns with the common rule as currently drafted. And then as for sort of who decides disputes, this has been tricky too, right? Do you have the Federal Trade Commission do it? Do you have the National Science Foundation do it? In the United States, in the EU, do you have data protection authorities or other regulators do it? That's really tricky. And I think it's uncontroversial to note that these are agencies that don't really have a lot of experience or expertise deciding how to resolve tussles between academic researchers and companies when they're making sort of finicky decisions about methods and privacy and security properties of research. So I think there is a lot of cause for optimism about legislative proposals. Like, it does seem like there is a window for real progress here, and that's terrific. But I also think we have to be very cognizant of the likely limitations of academic proposals in this space, right? Like, if your academic research agenda banks on Congress getting something done, that is probably a high-risk academic research agenda. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about law and public policy proposals in this area. Let me close by talking about ways in which technology might make some progress here, and that's been a focus of my own academic research. So the core idea that's motivated by a research group in our collaboration with Mozilla is, what if we had some way of studying real user behavior in real world settings, and we could measure users activity online, and we could also evaluate interventions in the user's online experience. And one way to do that is by using browser extensions, right? A web browser by design intermediates a user's interactions with a wide range of online services. There are limitations to that, of course, right? Browsers are just one way of interacting with services. Lots of interactions are via mobile apps now. Browser extension APIs are also limited. There are a lot of challenges to it, but this has been done before, and it is seemingly a very promising direction. So let me touch on some of the core challenges here, not the only challenges, but some of the recurring ones. How do you get participants into this type of study, right, where they install your browser extension? And ideally, you get some scale to the participant population. It's not just a few dozen people or even a few hundred people. That's really hard. How to instrument browser activity is hard. So the software interfaces that are available to browser extensions have changed quite a bit in recent years, and in many respects are not ideal for purposes of the type of instrumentation you might want to do for academic research. And then there's the sort of classic question of respecting participants when you collect and analyze their data, right? Where do you send this data? What is the environment you analyze it in? How do you make sure that what you're doing there protects participant privacy and is consistent with the scope of the consent they provide? So those are some of the core challenges. I'm going to talk about how we address those challenges shortly. Before getting to that, I want to mention some observations about this overall method just based on a recent literature review that my lab did. So we did an awful lot of Google Scholar sleuthing. And the net result was that first, browser-based research, while very powerful and it has been used in a diverse range of topics, is relatively rarely used, right? Compared to the types of topics we're talking about and the volume of literature in these topic areas, there are pretty few browser-based research studies. Moreover, the studies that do exist predominantly rely on commercial panels, so YouGov, for example, or Nielsen or ComScore, where researchers pay to get a copy of browsing data from folks who are, in general, providing their browsing data to one of these businesses. Those panels tend to have relatively unsophisticated and generic instrumentation. I'll touch on that shortly. And in some instances, they have some pretty questionable ethics practices. For example, giving participants points for when they're enrolled in giving browsing data, and then making it difficult to cash out those points, which I think you could argue is a type of dark pattern. The kinds of custom instrumentation that could be very powerful, especially for intervention studies, is pretty rare, and it's exceedingly rare outside of engineering and applied science disciplines, right? There aren't sort of social scientists at any particular scale using custom instrumentation methods. In those disciplines, when there's browser-based data, it's almost all commercial panel data. And the last point I just wanted to make based on our recent literature review was that data minimization just isn't very common here, right? The majority of studies just collect user browsing activity, sometimes you refer to as clickstream, and then analyze it for purposes of their study. And that's not ideal, right? That's kind of not consistent with best practices in respecting participants in the study. So here's a quick visualization from our literature review, just to sort of show that one of the core trade-offs we found in the literature that exists, right? The studies that involved instrumentation of the browser, sort of specific to what the study was trying to do, tended to have really small sample sizes. And the moment you wanted to get into larger sample sizes, you were talking about commercial data, which again tends to have unsophisticated methods, these ethics questions. It also is incredibly expensive, which also forecloses access for many research groups. Okay, so the core idea here is there some way in which we could democratize sophisticated browser-based research methods? And what we've built has two components, one called Rally, one called Web Science. Rally facilitates enrolling participants with a unified user experience and also handles reporting on the back end, right? So there's a data analysis environment that's access controlled, has audit logs, very sandboxed to respect participant privacy. And then in the middle, studies are built as ordinary browser extensions. And we have this library called Web Science that provides tons of reusable functionality for studies, so that for many of the things you might want to research, you just don't need to actually write that much code. And to give a specific example of that, there's a team at Stanford right now running a study using Rally and Web Science where there's actually very little study-specific code, right? They sort of configure things that Web Science already offers. There's studies about local news consumption, but study-specific logic there is really, really limited. So there's one validation data point. The Markup, which is an investigative newsroom, also recently launched a study with Rally and Web Science, again with relatively limited study-specific code. Okay, so let me actually show you what this thing looks like. So here's the landing page if you want to go use Rally as a study participant. You can read more about a study. So here's a pilot study we ran about cross-platform information flows focused on political and COVID-19 news. And you can read about what the study's trying to do, get some detail about what the study is going to collect, some information about the privacy practices of the study, of course, IRB information, a little bit about what academic group is behind the study. So quite a bit of detail available to participants if they want to understand it beyond the traditional academic consent form. And then if a user has enrolled in Rally overall, here's what the experience looks like for joining a study. Right, so there are these cards that concisely describe the study and the data that's going to be collected, link out to the full study details. If a user clicks, they get the traditional academic consent form too. Right now we have 2 of these studies running ourselves, and the Markup has a study running, and the Stanford GSB team has a study running. We have these optional demographic questions. So for many research questions, you do want to understand participant demographics, so we capture that too. Let me quickly touch on our current capabilities with the platform. So we have some quite sophisticated implementation for measuring how users engage with web pages, where users go on the web, how they transition between websites, how they pay attention to web content in ways that go quite a bit far beyond the traditional look at the referrer header, which is a sort of simplistic way of trying to track user activity across the web that's used some amount, or dwell time, right? How long the page was open in the user's browser. It turns out these things aren't great for tracking user engagement with content anymore, because people have lots of tabs open and might not be actually paying attention to content, even though the tab is open somewhere in their browser. And referrers have gotten limited quite a bit by some recent changes in how browsers work. We also support classifying web page text with NLP. We can classify web page elements. There's instrumentation if you want to look at user shares on Facebook or Twitter or Reddit, and user consumption of video with a special focus on YouTube. So there's an awful lot there. And then, of course, a bunch of supporting functionality about scheduling tasks for reporting data or aggregating data, more general study support functionality. I won't go into this example because I want to get into the Q&A, but in short, there's just, again, a much more sophisticated degree of instrumentation in user browsing and user transitions than you would find in typical browser instrumentation, right? So we can actually capture, the user got to this site because they typed it into the address bar, or they clicked a link and the page they clicked the link on previously was this specific other page that we have data about, or they paid attention to the page where attention factors in, was it the active tab, was it the active window, has the user recently moved their mouse and keyboard, a lot more sophisticated, or I should say move their mouse or typed on their keyboard, much more sophisticated than you currently get from things like dwell time. Okay, so we have a bunch of studies in the works. I've sketched some of them. We just launched a project on competition in the technology sector, which I'm really excited about. There's not nearly enough empirical work on anti-competitive business practices. So we have some work we've just launched on understanding search engine defaults, ballot interventions, and self-preferencing in search results. We have a project coming up trying to understand whether data portability initiatives are of value to users and and how they might be improved, some work on privacy policies in terms of service and broadband equity, among others. And as I mentioned, there's a team at Stanford currently looking at local news engagement, and a team at the Markup. Their focus is currently on how Facebook monitors users across the web. Okay, so I have just blathered on for quite a long time. So I'm going to stop there. That covers everything I wanted to get into. And now for the best part, I'm really interested to hear from you guys about these ideas and the specific research projects we've been working on. So thanks.
Jonathan, that was great. I have several questions, but I really want to open it up to the floor to our guests. So if anybody has a question, and Jonathan, I'm not sure if you can see, there was one that's in the chat. I'm happy to read it. And it's from George Osterholt, who says, could the area of threat modeling in cybersecurity be a possible set of methods for studying technology platform problems? It would still be limited, but may decrease the delta, or would this be implicitly biased?
So I think that type of framework, certainly you could apply to certain problems. My big picture take here for sort of any particular research direction and topic about the platforms is yes, right? Like there should be 1,000 flowers blooming here. Like I want to see a whole ecosystem of researchers with different disciplines and intellectual traditions and frameworks and topics they're addressing, looking at the platforms and get us beyond right now where there's just, again, very little work of the type that could substantiate evidence-based policymaking. So in short, yes.
Thanks, Jonathan. Here's a question from Simon Sun, who I'm actually the chair of his SJD. He's working on Section 230. And Simon asks, can you elaborate more on the crisis of data? What is your view on the approach of increasing transparency of companies' AI as a regulatory approach?
So one of the directions you can go with this type of research, right, with having some ability to access data or experiment, is to understand AI systems, right? So like recommender systems probably being the best known example, the Facebook feed or the Twitter timeline, right? Where we have very little insight at present. In fact, Twitter's recent paper, which was sort of their first big public effort at trying to understand echo chambers and filter bubbles on the timeline, the conclusion was we see a little bit of an effect here and we can't explain our own algorithm. So yeah, I think this is the type of work that could be part of that approach or complement a regulatory approach depending on the nature of the regulation. I think there is reason to be hesitant about some of the more procedure-oriented proposals of late, right? So, having nutrition label type disclosures about ML systems, and having some sort of like limited auditing of those systems done by the companies themselves. I mean, I think it's good. I fully support it, and I think it is a great step. But I think a real challenge is when interests collide, right? So for example, right, like when Google invested an awful lot in race bias issues related to the performance of its smartphone cameras, and then went out doing a whole marketing campaign around it, right? Like Google has a good alignment of incentives there, right? Like it is good for Google to address that problem and address it in a very public way. It is good for their customers. It is good for the company. But when you want to start asking questions about, let's say, bias effects in Google's advertising, which is the core of how they make money, they really don't seem to have much research coming out the door on that. And again, I think there's a lot of skepticism. There should be a lot of skepticism about whether companies will sort of be earnest rather than playing games and sort of minimizing disclosures and so on about these types of issues where there's a conflict. So in short, I view this as either part of that kind of approach or complementary to that type of approach, depending on the specifics of the approach. But with respect to some of the types of approaches that are getting a lot of attention of late, while I think they're very valuable, I think they also have some real limitations. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I was going to ask, should I touch on the second part of the question here?
Well, I want to open it up. We only have a few minutes. I want to make sure other people have an opportunity as well. And so one that jumps out to me, at least, is a Carol Choksey's question. And I apologize if I didn't pronounce that name correctly. Carol asks, could this be used in a class to track how students are researching open source information?
I don't see why not. I suppose that's between you and your students. Yeah, I don't see any reason in principle you couldn't do something like that.
And circling back up one, William Bowler asks, what are your thoughts on users who primarily use applications such as Facebook and Twitter apps and Discord?
So it's really, really hard to do independent research on mobile applications. There are, broadly speaking, 3 methods you might use. You might try to inspect user network traffic. And there have been some studies that set up something like a proxy or a VPN and man in the middle user traffic and then try to draw inferences based on that traffic. That has serious security and privacy implications, but that is one method that occasionally shows up in the literature. A second method is you could try taking frequent screenshots. There is a group at the Stanford Communications Department that's been trying that. I think they've run into a fair number of challenges with using the method, but it at any rate is another thing you might try. Then a third thing you might try is browser extensions on mobile devices. That's not going to get you mobile apps, but at least it gets you mobile browsing. There's very limited support right now, though, for extensions in mobile browsers. Firefox has a tiny bit of support. Safari is starting to add a little bit of support. Chrome really doesn't have much support. And then beyond that, I suppose you could root a device and give users a device you totally control or something like that. That raises all sorts of external ecological validity problems. And for the most part, you're only talking Android there. Now, the moment you want to start studying iOS, things get really locked down. And coincidentally, there's way more academic research on the app ecosystem on Android than there is on iOS. Anyway, so I think there are some directions, but they all have real limitations, and it's something we've been thinking about, as how to address as we move forward. Because yeah, there are a lot of users who access predominantly mobile apps, or mobile apps are at minimum a very significant part of the mix of how they use online services. It's a very significant challenge and a great question.
And then we have one from Sid Stam, who asks, have any mobile OS vendors, Apple, Google, expressed interest in collaborating with academics on instrumenting their platform, kind of like your project does with web browsing?
Hi, Sid. It's been a long time. Great to hear from you. In short, no. I did actually talk to one of the 2 major mobile OS vendors about this very direction, and got nowhere with it. So I think that would be a very valuable direction. I think the closest we have to that is Apple just introduced a new feature in iOS that allows users to download app privacy reports, which are some aggregate information about privacy related activities in the app. So that gives you a little bit, but certainly nowhere near the kind of research data access or ability to conduct experiments you might want more generally. So I guess if you're interested in studying, for example, Apple's platform lock-in, gosh, you're kind of out of luck.
And Jonathan, we have one more minute left here, and I want to ask you a question. What are legal academics missing in their literature, or perhaps what's something that a law student, what would be a good note? How could the work that you're doing collaboratively with computer scientists, what is the legal academy not doing that we could be doing better?
So I think there are sort of 2 broad ways in which law gets at these problems. One is removing barriers to data access, and the other is facilitating data access. I think we're in pretty good shape on the barriers piece, right? Like, people have not liked CFAA and DMCA and terms of service enforcement, et cetera, for a long, long time. Now, even the Supreme Court is disfavoring broad interpretations, at least of CFAA. And so, I don't think there's a ton more to say on that. It's not going to stop plenty more writing about it, but I think that's well covered. I think the question of how to structure researcher access to platform data, what some analogs to that are, how to think through the procedure issues, right? These are kind of like administrative procedure issues, like how do you facilitate the platform data access, almost FOIA-ish. I think are very underdeveloped in law and policy scholarship, right? I mean, folks have come up with various proposals. I touched on some of them, but I have not seen a really fulsome treatment of, sort of here are all the design levers you might pull here and the trade-offs of each. So I would love to see someone write that article.
Thank you so much. And so 2 last comments as we've hit the 1 o'clock hour. First, I want to just say for folks interested in this speaker series, our next talk is February 24th with Tracy Barnes, who is the Chief Information Officer for the Indiana Office of Technology, the state of Indiana. And secondly, Jonathan, thank you so much for starting off 2022 with a really important and well done talk. We hope to have you in person back here someday soon when times allow it. But thank you so much, Jonathan.
Well, thank you for hosting me. This was a lot of fun.
And I'm going to stop the recording.